Hello and welcome to The Key to Hiring Talent, why clarity is your competitive advantage. This is a webinar from Michael Page in partnership with the HR World. In the next 45 minutes, we'll be delving into exclusive new findings from Michael Page's Talent Trends report for 2025 and discuss the implication of those findings for today's organizations, HR and talent acquisition professionals. My name is Simon Kent and I am the head of content for the HR World. It's a unique network for HR professionals aimed at furthering the future of work. We do this through in-depth articles, opinion pieces and features, regular online webinars and in-person events. These enable HR professionals to discuss and develop the HR function. And you can find us at thehrworld.co.uk. This is a particularly challenging time for talent attraction and people management within organizations. Not only are we seeing some huge influences on the workplace, everything from economic penalties through to new employment rights, but candidates and employees are also presenting new challenges. The workforce is becoming increasingly age diverse, is demanding more reward at a time of financial challenge, and wants more say in how, when, and where it works. This is an ever-evolving talent market where employers need to take every advantage they possibly can to drive the business forward. In this webinar, we're going to move beyond the statistics of Talent Trends 2025 and help turn those statistics into tangible results. We're aiming to help you address candidate demands for clarity on salary, flexibility, culture, and more, so you can attract and retain the top talent you need. Our panel today are Doug Rode, Managing Director for UK and Ireland at Michael Page, Kate Shoesmith, Deputy CEO, Recruitment and Employment Confederation, and Laura Darnley, the partner in the Employment Department of Ward Hadaway. And I'm going to start off by asking each of them to give a brief introduction to themselves and their organisation. So Doug, if I can start with you, please.
Which can, Simon. Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction and the welcome. Thanks to the panelists and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm Doug Rode. I'm Managing Director of Michael Page here for UK and Ireland. So I've been with Page Group now for 27 years. So I've seen a fair amount of various different trends. I think whenever I speak on one of these webinars, I always say it's one of the most interesting times in the world of recruitment. But I'm not going to fail to say the same thing again. I think it's a really, really interesting time and looking forward to discussing some of these insights around what we're seeing from all of our customers and all of our candidates. That we place someone into a new role every 10 minutes or so of the working day. So we see a lot of things happening, a lot of things changing, but it's great to be able to bring some of this insight along.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Doug. Kate, if I can come to you next.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invite to both Page Group and to you, Simon. So I'm Kate and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive, who said, at the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. I'm totally with Doug. It's a really fascinating time in terms of what's happening in the labour market. I think what's most interesting is people are very interested in it, whereas perhaps before they thought it was something that happened externally and didn't necessarily need to think about it so much, whereas now it seems central to what we do. And to explain about the REC, we're the professional membership body for the UK recruitment industry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. And finally, Laura Darnley. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Simon. Thank you and welcome to everybody this morning. My name's Laura Darnley. I'm a partner at Ward Hadaway, which is a leading law firm based primarily in the north of England, offices across Leeds and Manchester and Newcastle, and soon to be Birmingham, so watch this space. The firm deals with all legal issues for businesses. Personally, my specialism is in people-related issues. So I specialise in dealing with employment law issues, primarily for businesses, and also in terms of immigration law issues, so hiring non-UK nationals to come and work in the UK. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I completely agree with both Doug and Kate that this is an incredibly interesting time from a professional perspective, looking at the Employment Rights Bill, about changes in terms of the legislative backdrop, in terms of the political climate, in terms of DEI policies, and then in terms of seeing what we're, how HR are having to adjust on the ground to those changing demands of their workforce, that intergenerational workforce that they're now looking at. You couldn't ask for a more interesting time to be looking at this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all very much. Before we get stuck into our discussion, I'd like to call on Doug to give us a little brief overview, I suppose, of Talent Trends 2025 in terms of sort of what are the findings, what are the striking things that you have seen coming out of this research?
Well, no, thank you, Simon. Look, I'm sure we're all aware, aren't we? We just touched on it now with the other panelists that if we have a look at the current economic and political climate, it's all having an impact on the recruitment landscape. I think definitive answers are hard to come by at the moment, and that's why research like this, I think is so important. Having pulled in data from almost 2,500 respondents across the UK to try and look at what the most important topics professionals are thinking about right now. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, I'm hopeful, confident that we'll have a bit more clarity from some conversations. It's a really interesting time in the market, as we said. I guess we're seeing what we're referring to as almost a wait and see workforce. Candidates are holding out for roles that suit all their requirements, while many organisations are navigating pretty uncertain times. And in many cases, that's leading to pretty cautious hiring approaches. And this isn't just a UK thing, we're seeing it in most of our other international markets that we operate into. But I guess it's understandable when you look at the shifts that we've been seeing both in the global economy and geopolitically, all in relatively short space of time. Combine that with some more specific UK policy decision, and perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised with where we are. But in many cases, hiring managers are trying to manage much tighter recruitment budgets. In turn, this is going to mean even greater pressure to find the right candidate. And on top of that, there's a need for creativity, I think, in terms of both benefits and other employee perks to make sure the offer anyone's going to be given to join an organisation is as competitive as possible. Another trend that we've been seeing is actually roles getting amalgamated, different roles being pulled together in looking for cost efficiencies. But again, this creates a need for even greater clarity. You need to be transparent with candidates perhaps who are joining the organisation around the expectations and responsibilities of the role they're going to be moving into. Otherwise, you might have surprises or potentially overwhelm new hires once they're in post. This all leads nicely into the overall trend that we found from our research and what we're witnessing across the board, which is professionals are looking for clarity. In today's market, people are clear on what they want from a prospective role. Businesses need to take time to really establish and articulate what they can offer, what they expect in return, and if they get that right, the best businesses ultimately can still secure the best talent. But increasingly, people are simply not willing to change jobs unless they're certain all their needs are going to be met. To find this out, they're asking about 5 key things which come through in the survey: salary, flexibility, technology, culture, and values. And being transparent with your employees and applicants is going to make the difference between maintaining your competitive edge or potentially losing your star performers. So some meaty topics for us to discuss. So Simon, let me hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Doug. Excellent stuff. Just before we launch into the first question, please, if you do have your own questions or comments that you'd like to make as we go along, do please use the question box and so on that you have. If we are able to, we will sort of address those questions maybe towards the end. We'll see how we go. Okay, thank you very much. Doug, what you were talking about there in terms of scene setting and so on, and the fact that people are looking for, they're being quite particular in terms of what they want from a job and so on. What strikes me here is the EVP, the employee value proposition. So this is I guess what organizations put together in order to attract candidates, but it's also what they're going to be measured against once that person arrives. And I guess the match between the two is really going to be the key to whether people stay or go or are disappointed or motivated. What do you think are the key components to making a compelling EVP? And how can organizations ensure that it does resonate for candidates and that it does do the job of attracting people?
Thanks, Simon. There's a great starting point, isn't there? All these questions, there's plenty of layers to all of it.
Yeah.
I think this is evolving too, if I'm honest. Look, I think when you look at from a reality of candidates looking to join an organisation or stay, they're trying to work out for an EVP, what am I getting in exchange, beyond my basic pay and rations? What does it feel like to work there? What am I getting back in terms of my skills, time and experience bring? And because of that, I think the way that it's evolving has got to be more than words on a page. I think you see some organisations who perhaps have created an EVP in a lab rather than creating an EVP in their organisation, and therefore they've got some great words, but if the reality of what I'm experiencing day to day doesn't reconcile with what you're telling me, ultimately that becomes a bit of a problem, particularly around some of this clarity stuff. So I think it's more important than ever, but it's harder than ever. Laura's touching on multi-generational workforces, those sort of things. How do you make sure that what you're positioning, what you're trying to do is inclusive? It does speak to everyone in your organisation. And I think this is, again, where the clarity piece comes in. Because I think we've seen a lot of organisations try to be all things to all people. The challenge of being all things to all people is sometimes that can't be authentic to anybody, and it falls in between the cracks. And that's when you come back to words rather than actions around how it tends to feel within an organisation. So I do think it's something that's got to be created from within. I think it's something that therefore you're going to be able to stand by, but also bring to life, so that actually, if you spoke to a number of employees, they could articulate actually what it meant. And I think that's how we're seeing that communication and sort of building of that EVP evolve.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kate, is this something that you see as important among employers as well? Is it something that they are trying to get right from the start?
Yeah, really do. And one of the crucial things that happens is recruitment businesses acting as that intermediary. They're often on the receiving end of both sides. So they hear from the candidate and they hear from their client, and they can see that those two stories don't necessarily match. And trying to translate that and trying to then very gently guide into actually where have you got a communication issue. I like the title of the report in particular around clarity, and I think it picks up on something that is so essential. It's come through in a number of different places, hasn't it, recently? Edelman always do their trust barometer, and the really interesting thing about this year's was that every category you saw a decline in trust, and that includes business, and they're normally the most trusted category. The other thing that I saw recently was the BBC Workplace Culture Review. And I found that interesting because, again, if you think about our sector and about how it places people into both permanent jobs and into, it can be contract, contingent, it could be freelancers. So the BBC report looked at the workforce across the whole because they have lots of freelancers. And the big theme that came across was openness and transparency and the importance of it, that consistency of message. And I'm reflecting on something where you have to have an EVP which speaks to everybody, but feels individualistic enough that it can also work for me. So the trust becomes super important in how somebody is organizing their work. They can do that within parameters where they're guided. And I come back to something that I think we all probably learned quite early on in our careers is, well, what are you most interested in? Are you interested in my inputs and what I'm doing and how am I doing it? Or are you really interested in the outcomes? And actually, I think the tension becomes, well, actually, I might be interested in a bit of both because I want to know you're doing it the right way. And that really matters. And equally, you want to know the employer is doing something the right way. So it's a contract in the truest sense. It's not just that straight out contract of how you are, what you're going to be paid and the benefits. The EVP and communicating that well from the get-go is all essential, whether it's a short-term contract or it's a permanent new job.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting. And so some of the statistics that are within talent trends, which are pertinent to this, it's sort of saying 39% of businesses struggled to hire in the last year. 39% of businesses struggled to hire in the last year. 43% say matching salary expectations was difficult, but the same percentage say finding the right skills was difficult. 35% say finding candidates who match the company culture and fit was behind this. So it's not, it really isn't just one thing, is it? It's not just sort of one bit of miscommunication. It seems to be this is something that goes quite across the board. And Laura, in your experience, I mean, is this something which employers are still trying to get right, but don't quite? I mean, the one thing that does occur to me is the salary transparency, which is quite important here, and employers who still don't do that kind of thing. But what are you seeing in terms of how much transparency and clarity people are actually offering?
I think, I totally agree with Doug and Kate and the comments that they've made in terms of the importance of that transparency, that clear commitment to employees in the same way as they're committing to the employer to do a role, and
Mm,
not just having those policies in isolation, being authentic, living and breathing those policies. And I think what I've really seen is where that trust has been eroded because there's been an about turn in what's allowed or what's not. So thinking about, return to the office
mm,
mandates, for example. Um, there are legal issues around changing employees' contracts. So there is an issue around matching the EVP to your documentation, to what you promise to do for employees. So if you want to unilaterally change that, you can't just change an employee's contract without there being ramifications.
mm,
But it goes deeper than that. It's not just about a potential claim for breach of contract or other employment tribunal rights. It's about completely destroying that trust, destroying where employees thought they had that certainty around what an employer was committing to do for them. So I think instilling that trust, that lived experience of that authenticity and those values around parameters. Don't get me wrong, it's not about a free for all, but having that clear messaging is really important, because once that trust is broken down, as Kate was referring to in the statistics, really hard to build it back up again. And that's then going to impact on your ability to hire going forwards. You just look at the press reports around some of the way the return to the office mandates have been handled. It hasn't landed very well.
mm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think what's also interesting here is that rather than it being a specifically legal, as you say, breach of contract kind of thing, the implications seem more serious around reputation, and the way in which people will then regard an employer. That's not just for new recruits, new talent coming into your organization. Of course that's important, but it's also going to be in terms of customer experience and customer expectation as well. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, there are, don't get me wrong, there are legal issues associated with that. And when
absolutely.
the
Yeah.
Employment Rights Bill comes through, those legal issues will become even more important, and there will be potential ramifications for employers looking to make those changes. But I think it is that wider perception and the way in which public opinion has reacted to these changes. In terms of, like you say, customer engagement, that trust in the organization can be really quite drastically eroded if the
Mm.
culture and the values are not lived and thought through properly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, we mentioned a bit about the sort of the mobility of the workforce and how they do want to just keep on a wait and see workforce, if you like, who want to find the right place before they commit to something. One of these statistics from the report was 47% of candidates are actively looking for a role, which is a steady increase compared with 46% last year. Why do you think there is a consistent mobility trend among the workforce? Kate, do you think there is sort of what Doug described as the wait and see element of the workforce? Are people just sort of saying, I'm not going to commit until it's right? Do they have more choice to do it? Has something changed in terms of why people won't commit or why they want to sort of keep their options open?
I think there's real differences across population areas, sectors, geographies on some
Right.
of this. So I don't disagree that in some professional services sectors, you absolutely will see people waiting out for the right job, right time for them, and you can see that we've there's been that whole set of statistics you just gave us about how employers still find it really difficult to hire. Our latest labour market tracker was out again this morning, and what that does is it looks at job postings. The little surprise in it was that there were more job postings in April, a month that had a late Easter and the national insurance rise plus the national minimum wage rise, than there were in March. And it kind of just speaks to this thing of, well, employers kind of just need to get on with it. They have roles to fill,
Yeah.
and although we talk about an unemployment rate that again marginally has ticked up and economic inactivity levels has marginally ticked down, those job vacancies can be really difficult to hire for, and no end of trying to manufacture people to fit the boxes for those roles is going to help, because it's not as simple as and I get asked this on media rounds quite often, is, well, how come there's unemployment if we have job vacancies? Surely we should just put people into those jobs. It's like, doesn't quite
Doesn't
doesn't
quite work like
quite work. Yeah,
that.
supply and demand equations, if only they were that simple, that would be
Yeah.
lovely. So you do get differences in terms of the sectors that people are in and what their specific situations are. But in terms of why is there mobility? Some of it is a forced choice because businesses are changing and they're changing rapidly. And it is a case of, do you opt out before you're opted out for you? Or is this the place for me? Tends to be one of the themes. Obviously, there has been a bit of a lull in terms of hiring overall over the last 18 months to 2 years. So some people have faced redundancy programs and moving on. But the big theme that we get all the time from candidates is that we're actively being told that work should be fulfilling and that we
Yep.
should have a sense of purpose. So I'm going to be constantly striving and looking for that purpose because work is that place for me now. And B, that change is good and we should be adaptable and we should be looking for development opportunities. So the culture that we're creating is telling people that they should be looking to move as well. So I think that is something that's really important in terms of why do candidates make some of these choices?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting that it becomes a kind of like, okay, so that is what you should be after. This is your expectation, and you carry on until you get it. And Doug, if you're faced with that within your candidate pool and so on, how do you react to that as an employer? Is that sort of like the stakes have been raised again? How do you sort of react to such a mobile workforce?
I think that there's a balance to it, Simon. I think that we've always had one. So I think that the fact there's a slight trend up and it's a trajectory, I think it's always been there. And it probably also comes back down to a balance of how well you're managing the people within your organisation to be able to paint a picture of the next opportunity. I think it's going to be really interesting when you look over the next 6 to 9 months. I think the definition of actively looking is a funny one. So that's also changed over the years. So for lots of people, that means I might have an active search on a job board or I might keep half an eye out on LinkedIn. It doesn't mean I'm filling out applications or applying for jobs. It means I'm keeping half an eye out on there and I'm interested in a conversation to see whether it's going to meet my criteria at this point in time or not. So I think that's probably more of a definition of actively looking than necessarily, attending interviews, but keeping an eye out there about what's going on, and that's increasingly maybe easier to do that. I think the other thing that's going to be really interesting is if, as Kate says, there's been less recruitment going on over the last 18 months, 2 years or so, based on circumstance, conditions externally. But a lot of people moved jobs post-COVID. So if you look at the churn rate of the number of people who moved post-COVID and got a new job for a pretty substantial uplift in many cases, if you look at the length of tenure people spend in a job, maybe that is 2.5, 3 years. It means from that big volume of people that moved a couple of years ago, potentially, if history repeats itself, they're starting to become interested in new roles now anyway, in the natural course of how they might manage their career. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that flows through if we start to see a pickup in vacancies, and that's fantastic to hear from the REC's latest data. Long may that continue. But I think it's going to be fantastic to see then actually how people react. I think the other thing's been really interesting from some of the previous talent trends data we've seen is people have been tempering maybe their ambitions between work-life balance and actually will I move to make a career move. So I think maybe some people's career aspirations may have been tempered, but their life continues to move on. So if their work-life balance or their situation or what they need outside of work has changed over the last couple of years too, it may also mean that they're going to start looking for an opportunity in a slightly different way again. Because maybe potentially job moves will move more with life circumstance now necessarily, or rather necessarily for particular career drive or ambition. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what that 47% turns into over the next 6 to 9 months or so.
Absolutely, absolutely. Laura, what's your take on this, not only now but in the future? Because I think one of the things that you had mentioned previously with the impact of what the Employment Rights Bill might do for the mobility of employees as well.
Yeah, I think there's a number of points that both Kate and Doug have touched on in terms of, moving aside from the legal points for a second, in terms of attitudes to work. I think the idea of a job for life no longer exists. It's very standard and normal to move jobs. And certainly, anecdotally, and what I'm seeing from my clients in particular is that the workforce will turn over in order to chase down a salary increase or to chase down another opportunity for career progression. I think, with the economic pressures on the cost of living, people are looking for those salary jumps. And very often that is achieved through a move rather than staying put and being rewarded with your existing employer. On the kind of Employment Rights Bill side, there are going to be a whole host of changes that potentially shift that pendulum towards employee rights and enhancing those employee rights as compared to where we have been in terms of that legal balance. One of the examples, just to give you a quick example, is to give everybody day one employment law rights from protection from being unfairly dismissed. Currently, you have a 2-year kind of wait period before you hit eligibility. And interestingly, when the Labour government was proposing its manifesto, and I forget which green or white paper, one of the coloured paper types in respect of those changes, they specifically commented that they thought that this would be a good thing because it would enhance that job mobility and enable people to move job roles without having to wait for that magic 2-year period to get protection from a legal perspective. And that to me is fascinating, because if that is a stated aim of policy to increase job mobility, that then feeds into all the things that we're talking about that Doug and Kate have both picked up on.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's also it's an interesting way of increasing job mobility as well. I think it's sort of I can see that it's good for the employees and so on.
I'm not sure that people do move, I'm not sure that people do hang out in a job if it's not working for them for 2 years just to tick their unfair dismissal box.
Absolutely.
But, that was the stated aim in the paper.
And Laura, I find that really interesting, because if you've got the other side of that coin, which is how do you protect people who are in temporary, it might be agency work, it might be contract, it might be freelance work. Are they asking for that protection in that case? Because I think you can't do both, job mobility and saying that we don't necessarily think that the temporary labour market is always what everybody wants. You need to balance those things really finely, don't you? I know in our conversations with government, I feel like they've moved on a considerable way. So whereas pre-general election, I would have said there would be officials within the Labour Party that were really anti anything that looked like a temporary labour market, just had quite old-fashioned preconceived ideas about it. And actually now, when you talk to people within government about, well, what does somebody get from working that way? Why do they choose to do it? Is it because they have family responsibilities, caring responsibilities? Is it because they're studying? Are they doing something that fulfills them in a different way? Have they got a side hustle? Are they? Doug talked about work-life balance and how they're managing that just for themselves. You've got to have those two things running concurrently. If you want jobs mobility, you have a really strong, well-regulated temporary labour market.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Kate, because in terms of some of the other ERB proposals around guaranteed hours and banning exploitative 0 hours contracts, it's balancing those stated policy aims that they've set up very clearly in the manifesto with what people are setting their sights on the ground, because you're quite right, not everybody is on an exploitative 0 hours contract and not everybody wants a permanent contract or guaranteed hours. A lot of my clients work in this sector and their workforce are very happy. They may go and ask people if they would like to be on a permanent contract or a guaranteed contract, and very often they'll get no thank you as a response because it doesn't fit their life. So I think there is a tension here between the legislative aims and what we're seeing on the ground in terms of the workforce.
Absolutely. Very interesting, very interesting. But also, let's move on a bit, but still in terms of the flexibility here, one of the areas of certainty which I think has emerged from the report is to do with sort of the remote hybrid flexible work arrangements for employees. And sort of having, obviously, even now, you still have the right to sort of decide about flexible work or to put in a call to have your work done flexibly and so on. And also, as we've seen recently, there's been a number of attempts to get people back into the office, and the way in which those calls have gone down has been interesting as well. But there seems to be a difficult sort of situation here. On the one hand, offering your employees the flexibility that they want. On the other hand, as an organization, especially in today's economy, you need your own flexibility to be able to sort of pivot, go after things, be an agile organization, move people around if you need to, and so on. Is that a particularly difficult area of this to reconcile? I mean, how can you provide enough certainty, I suppose, around your flexible policy that satisfies people while still retaining the agility that your organization might need in the face of really quite challenging markets? Doug, what do you see in terms of where do you think, is there a line to be drawn on flexibility, or is it just sort of like we're going to be flexible about the flexibility?
It's a really hard one, isn't it? And it's hard to, those organisations that appear to have settled things down, it comes back to a level of clarity again, I think, in terms of them being able to articulate what they want, but also perhaps why they want it. I think where you're seeing frustrations from people, you're right, is like how it's potentially evolved. So if it's sort of a bit of the boiling frog analogy, isn't it? So, you used to be able to work from home, and now you come in a couple of days a week, but pick which days a week you want. And now I want you in 5 days a week, and I want you in from these hours. That's quite a perspective organisations have shifted along in a fairly short period of time, and perhaps without necessarily articulating why, potentially articulating what the benefit's going to be for those employees. Potentially not thinking about some of the timing about when they've given people a runway to do that, not do that. And I think there's also a challenge about how evenly it can be applied within organisations. So are there different departments that are doing different things? Are there different interpretations of what people are doing? And that's where organisations maybe are getting a bit stuck. And I think it is a challenge. I think it is a real challenge too about, if I go back to my own organisation, my own business, we made a decision last year that in order for us to be successful, we needed to work together more. And we believe that the office played maybe more of a part in that than it had done previously. And we had to go and communicate that to people as to the reason why. Was it universally popular? No. Was it universally understood? Yes. Did we potentially lose some people from our organisation because they didn't want to go on that shift because it didn't work for them. Unfortunately, yes, we did. But I think what we've also learned is going out to hire more people for our organisation and bring them back in, being able to be clear with them and say, this is why we work, how we work. This is what we believe works well for our organisation, and because of that will enable you to be successful within our organisation. And we're able to be clear with that with people from the start. And I think that then makes a difference to people joining the organisation, that they're comfortable that that's how it's going to be. And I think the other bit is, I think flexibility and days in the office have become a bit too intertwined. And actually, they're different things, right? You can be in the office 7 days a week and still have flexibility, can't you? I think in terms of when you do your work, how you do your work, how you do your work best, and how you perform. And I think that's the other balance, that we just maybe need to pull these couple of things apart and go, actually, what do we mean by flexibility? But again, what does it mean in your organisation? And what does it mean in terms of what I expect from you, but what will you expect from me as an employer? And I think they are the conversations that, again, have to be live and real and dynamic, as you say, because there might be occasions where you might need to flex on that one way or the other. You know, flexibility is not about necessarily just setting a different hours culture, is it? It's about actually how do we work together to get the best outcomes. So I guess to answer your question, it is tricky. It's tricky, but I think those, again, being clear, are probably those that are winning both ways around.
Yeah. Interesting stats again from the report. 46% of employees think that they are more productive at home. Meanwhile, 43% of managers believe their team is more productive in the office. So they're sort of like similar thing. Kate, I mean, how do you see this? Do you think that employers need to retain the right, if you like, to sort of be able to decide where somebody is working, or again, is this sort of a communication thing that should be set up and understood?
The communication point is the critical one for me, and it all goes back to that clarity, transparency, openness that is the theme of the report. It's those numbers alone, Simon, they point to the gulf, don't they, that could be exploited in some ways, and we need to really, I think it's a really clear area of focus. If you've got a workforce that feels that one way, but the management leadership feels another way, then that gap needs to be narrowed somehow, because there should be a mutual understanding of both sides. I work in a desk-based profession, so there is that ability to work from anywhere, supposedly, although I still need to see, in my case, members. I need to go to government meetings, and being in the room, there is no replacement. Absolutely, like, you know, as much as you try, it's not the same in terms of building relationships, building trust. I would say it's and people, like, as part of your career journey, people building that relationship with you is good for your career. Is you know, having those one-to-one relationships and meetings. At the same time, there is a balance, isn't there? But I think about other sectors a lot in this regard, and about how you manage that, where you have frontline staff who have to be on premises, have to be in the place of work, and when it's a situation of, can the management work from home, that doesn't feel fair, does it? So it's got to be transparency, it's got to be fit for purpose, and you've got to really communicate it well. And I think what Doug was saying in terms of, do you understand where we're coming from, and how do we test this out and work it out over time? Where's the evidence base? I think becomes all the more important, because we should be data led. And in one sense, we had the pandemic was done to all of us. It forced a situation upon us. We're unpicking some of that now. What we don't want to do is, we don't want to move too far back the other way too quickly without having learned some of the lessons from the pandemic.
Sure, absolutely. Laura, what's your view on this in terms of who should decide, where should the priorities lie in terms of where people are working, and how easy is it to change that?
So from my perspective, again, I completely agree with Kate and Doug. We're all very, very in agreement on the panel. But in terms of being clear, in terms of being clear about your expectations as an employer, and having that data to, what's important to you as an employer. What are you measuring? What's your measure of success? Is it a presence? Is it being in on certain days? Is it an output? If you're going to ask people to do things, if you can explain the why, you will get more buy-in. Because from a legal perspective, where you sometimes get into difficulties is you'll have a particular term in a contract that says, I work from home 5 days a week, for example. You then want to change that because you've decided as an employer you have a rationale for bringing them in. That then puts you in a difficult position because the employee has a right to insist on their contractual terms. So there are contractual issues about what you've said and how you've articulated, coming back to the employee value proposition. What you've articulated in that and what you've kind of set down in those documents is important. In addition, you've got those implied rights. So if you've let people work from home for a considerable period, they've got an expectation that that's what their contract potentially says. So I often get asked to help clients change the parameters to clarify where they want them to sit. And again, if you can articulate the why, you are more likely to get that buy-in and that appreciation. I think where people get very frustrated is, I've got to be in 5 days a week, but like Kate says, the manager's swanning off at home somewhere, or you're sat in 5 days a week on Teams meetings, which just seems, rather pointless. If you can explain what that purpose is, I think you're going to have a much easier job. And then the only other point I just wanted to pull out is the idea of just highlighting that there is a legal right to make flexible working requests. You touched on that, Simon. Yeah. All employees from day one have a legal right to request to work flexibly. And that's not just about, like Doug says, working from home. It could be, changing hours, compressing hours, all sorts of different ways in which flexibility can be instilled. It's not a right to have flexible working, it is a right to request. And even under the Employment Rights Bill changes that are being proposed, it's not flexible working by default. And I think it's been rather misreported in a lot of press commentary that, once these changes come in, everybody will have the ability to dictate how they work for their employers. That's not going to be the case. It will still be the right to ask. But what the Employment Rights Bill will do is give employees the ability to challenge those rationales for refusing. So if an employer says, no, you can't have that flexible arrangement because of, costs or whatever it might be, there are 8 statutory reasons that they can rely on. An employee would have the ability to say, let me just test that. Let me test that at tribunal. Is that a reasonable response for you to take? So there is a slight shift, but it isn't flexible working by default. And if you can get things right at the outset and have that communication and dialogue with your employees, you can be agile. You can be able to adjust to those economic forces. But it's all about getting that communication and that trust right.
Sure. Absolutely. I'm going to, this will be, I'm aware of the time, but I just want to get in one last question, which might sort of encapsulate things a little bit, but it does sort of pick up on that trust issue again, which I think we've returned to an awful lot during this conversation. As we all know, this is a really challenging time generally, globally. Economic uncertainty, geopolitical frictions, things that are happening around the whole DE&I agenda as well. Given all of these things that are happening, what does trust look like, and how can leaders actually inspire greater trust? I think one of the statistic is that nearly half, 43%, nearly half, of employees express a lack of trust in their leadership to balance business needs with their well-being. So that's from the report. I just want to say discuss, really, rather than take this any further. Kate, how would you inspire trust? What do you think needs to happen in order to turn this tide a little bit?
For me personally, trust looks like consistency. And I think that consistency of message is all important. I also think that there's a sense of, are you getting the right message across to the right people? And if you're not, what might you do in terms of really tapping into others who can help you with that? And what I'm getting at is sometimes I think you can have situations where you put a cohort of workers in a room, and then the leadership comes and talks to them, and they're expected to be, you know, like really open with the leadership team and tell them everything they think. That might happen. It also might not. you might not get to hear anything that's actually really valuable. So where can you use some of your external suppliers, your providers of those services, to really understand that? And never is that more important than at the start of the journey. So when you're bringing in new members of a team, they will say things to their recruiter that they're not necessarily going to say in front of the hiring manager, and being able to broach some of those subjects that, you know, traditionally it was always like, actually, let's have a proper conversation about the pay, because it's a bit too embarrassing. Maybe it's because we're a bit British to raise this in front of the hiring manager. But actually using that intermediary service for what it's meant for, and then client businesses generally taking on some proper consultancy advice, communication experts, people that are talking to the candidates, they're talking to the people that you're looking to hire, bring them in, let them explain to you how it really is, rather than thinking you're going to get the full story. I'd say from talking directly to your work groups. I think just know that you might get a version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, how do we instill more trust?
I think from my perspective, just focusing in on the sort of DEI type issue and building trust in respect of some of those pressures, to me, it's about perhaps reframing that message in terms of an inclusive workplace. So I think one of the things that I've been seeing with a lot of my clients is just looking at how you can instill that psychological safety where employees can be authentic and really feel like they belong in the workplace. They're able to bring their true selves to work, obviously within professional parameters, but, you know, can be as authentic as possible in the professional space. And I think that aligns really well with responding to some of these pressures without ignoring the fact that, you know, the UK has a very different cultural and legislative framework than perhaps the US does. You know, we have strong protections against discrimination. There are very significant consequences if you do not protect your employees from being discriminated against, very significant uncapped tribunal awards. But I think potentially reframing the employee journey into being one of inclusivity will help foster that trust with their employer, because those statistics are quite worrying. You know, if we look at where we are in the state of the employment market, that's not a good place for us to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Doug.
I agree completely with Laura and Kate. I think it's really interesting, isn't it, around how the pressures of business kind of then turn into pressures of reality, can turn into how people communicate with their workforce. And we've spent as organizations, you know, the last few years embracing inclusivity in lots of different forms, spending a lot of time surveying our people, asking our people what they think, asking our people what they'd like, and trying to accommodate that and bring it into organizations. And that's what lots of forward thinking organizations have done. There's then been a level of reality where organizations have had to react quite quickly to some different shorter term pressures. And the culture of let me go and ask, understand what you want and talk to you about what you want has potentially changed in organizations to no, we just have to do this now. It's about the organization surviving. It's about us being fit for purpose. It's about these things. And therefore, asking and listening has turned to tell. And I think, therefore, the challenge ends up being how do we get the balance between those two things in those sort of conversations, and how do we get the communication right? So there may always have to be a level of a tell, but can it be, look, we need to go this way. Can we get your input in how we do it? Or we need to go this way, and these are the reasons and the rationale why, and this is how we have to react. And maybe this is why we've had to make the changes in the organisation. And those things maybe aren't always popular, but they just are decisions that have to be made. So I think being able to communicate them and the rationale is key. But I think because we've gone from these two different positions, I think that's why the trust equation feels a little bit broken, as in people wanted to listen to me, but maybe they don't want to listen to me. Or maybe if I tell them what I think now, they can't act on it in the same way, because actually the pressures of something else might be pulling them in a different way. And I think that's the challenge that organisations are facing. So it does come back to how can you communicate with people? I don't think you can communicate enough. And I think from a leadership perspective, actually getting out in front of people is hugely key. I think those kind of, whether it's town halls, whether it's workshops, whether it's being able to press the flesh with people and understand the impact of the decisions that potentially have been made, because there's always unintended consequences, aren't there, if people are making decisions without being able to necessarily consult. There's always ways that you can learn off the back of that, I think, and try and bring it to life a little bit more. So I think from a leadership perspective, it's never been as important as being able to get out in front and talk to people.
Brilliant. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Doug. And we will end on that message. So I would just like to thank our panel for this morning, Laura Darnley, Kate Shoesmith and Doug Rowe. Do download Talent Trends 2025. It is full of incredible statistics, information, very good sort of basis for you to start making the next decisions for HR, for talent acquisition, for people management in general. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
If you found this video helpful for your recruitment journey, why not subscribe to our channel? And don't forget to tap the bell to get the latest videos first.